He was the world's most wanted drug trafficker. For decades, the ruthless Joaquim El Chapo Guzmen destroyed millions of lives and reaped billions of dollars.
We talk about El Chapo like he appeared out of thin air, like one day the mountains of Sinaloa just produced the most powerful drug lord the world had ever seen, fully formed, fully dangerous, and ready to build an empire that would stretch from the poppy fields of Mexico all the way to the streets of Chicago, New York, and London. We talk about his escapes, his tunnels, his billions, his wives. We talk about his sons, we talk about his enemies. But here is what almost nobody talks about. Before El Chapo was El Chapo, before he was a name that made government officials sweat and rival cartel leaders pray, he was a little boy being beaten by his father in a shack in the mountains of Sinaloa. And that father? He was the one who put a drug operation in his son's hands before he was old enough to be in middle school. What if I told you that the man responsible for creating the most powerful narco in human history was not a cartel boss, not a rival trafficker, not a corrupt politician, but a subsistence farmer from a mountain village with fewer than 100 people? What if I told you that El Chapo's own mother, the woman he built a chapel for, the woman he called his emotional foundation, was fully aware of what was happening in her home, what her son was being taught, and chose to stay silent about all of it? And this is not just the story of Joaquin Guzmen. This is the story of the family that made him, the people who handed him his first drug crop and called it chores, the people who opened a door to organized crime and called it survival. And today we are going inside that story, because you cannot understand El Chapo without understanding the two people who built him from the ground up. Stay with me, because what you are about to hear changes everything you thought you knew about where monsters come from. Before we get to Emilio Guzman Bustillos, before we get to what he did and what he passed down, you need to understand the place that made him too. Because Badiraguato, Sinaloa, is not just a location, it is a condition. Imagine a cluster of settlements buried deep in the Sierra Madre Occidental, the mountain range that cuts through northwestern Mexico like a wall. No real roads in the 1950s and 60s, no hospital, no economy, no future that you could plan for, save for, or work toward in any conventional sense. The soil in that region grows two things particularly well: corn, which feeds a family but makes no money, and opium poppies, which make money but feed nothing good. This is the terrain Emilio Guzman Bustillos was born into, somewhere around 1922. He came from a long line of La Tuna residents. The Guzman family had been in that community for generations. There was no leaving. There was no great migration story or escape plan. You were born in La Tuna, you farmed in La Tuna, and you died in La Tuna. The question was only ever what you farmed. On paper, Emilio was a cattle rancher. That was the official title. The thing you told people when someone from outside the mountains asked what you did for a living. But the mountains of Badiraguato had an open secret. Nearly every man who called himself a rancher was also something else: a gamero, an opium poppy farmer. Men who would plant the poppy crop, tend it through the season, and at harvest time score the bulbs with small blades to extract the sticky, valuable gum inside. Raw opium, the base material for heroin. 1 kilogram of that gum brought in the equivalent of around $700 in today's money. For a family with nothing, that was everything. Emilio was no different. He raised cattle, yes. He also almost certainly farmed poppies. And at some point in the 50s and 60s, as his family grew and the bills that poor families always have continued to pile up, the drug side of the operation became less of a side hustle and more of the whole point. He married Maria Consuelo Loera Perez, a woman from the same village, and together they had a large family. The numbers vary depending on the source. Some say 6 surviving children, some say as many as 11 total were born, with 5 dying young from illness and malnutrition. That kind of loss was normal in La Tuna. That kind of poverty was normal. What was not going to be normal was the son they would raise in the middle of it. Joaquin Archivaldo Guzman Loera came into the world on April 4, 1957 in the settlement of La Tuna. He was a small, stocky kid, the kind of build that mountain terrain produces. He had an older set of brothers who reportedly died before he was old enough to remember them clearly. Then came him, then came Miguel Angel, Aureliano, Arturo, and Emilio Jr., then his sisters Armida and Bernarda. His early years looked from the outside like most of the other children in La Tuna. Except they do not. Because Emilio Guzman did not raise his son with a vision of escape or a dream of something different. He raised his son to continue the operation. From the very beginning, before Joaquin was old enough to carry a machete, the family structure revolved around the drug trade. There were poppies to plant, crops to tend, gum to harvest, and product to move. That was the rhythm of the household. That was what family meant in the Guzman home. Joaquin started at the very bottom. Not the bottom of a cartel, but the literal bottom of his father's farm operation. Too young to work the fields, he stayed close to his mother and brought his older brothers their lunch on the mountain trails. When he got older, he joined the men on those trails himself, hiking through rough terrain during harvest season to cut the poppy buds alongside his brothers, his father, and whatever other male relatives the operation required. By the time he was 9 years old, Joaquin Guzman was already working in the marijuana and poppy fields around La Tuna. 9 years old. This is not a figure of speech or a generalization. This comes directly from Sean Penn's recorded conversation with El Chapo himself. That was his childhood. Not a schoolyard, not a little league field, a poppy field in the mountains of Sinaloa doing whatever his father told him to do, and the nearest school, over 100 kilometers away. There were traveling teachers who came through La Tuna and stayed for a few months before moving on to other communities. That was the entire education system available to Joaquin Guzman, and even that limited education was cut off before it could take root. Emilio pulled his son out of school in the third grade. Third grade. Joaquin was still a small child when his father decided the family operation needed him more than the classroom did. He sold oranges on the roadside. He helped cultivate the crops. He learned the geography of the drug supply chain not from a book, but from walking it, working it, living it every single day. The result, confirmed at his trial and in every biographical account, is that El Chapo, the most powerful drug trafficker in history, is functionally illiterate. He can barely read, because his father took away the only chance he had to learn. This was not a reluctant introduction to crime. Emilio Guzman did not stand helplessly by while circumstances dragged his son into a bad world. He was the circumstances. He ran the operation. He set the schedule. He pulled Joaquin out of school. He put him in the fields. He handed him the product and showed him the chain. Now, you might think that a father who brought his son into the family business had some kind of bond with that son, some kind of alliance, even if it was criminal. And the answer is more complicated and darker than that. Emilio Guzman was a violent man, not violent in the way we will later use that word to describe El Chapo's organization. Violent in the way that is quieter and stays inside four walls. He beat his children, regularly, consistently, not the occasional discipline that poor families in hard conditions sometimes rationalized, but a pattern of abuse that left enough of a mark on Joaquin's memory that it remained part of his documented biography decades later. Young Joaquin would run from the beatings, slip out of the house and make his way to his maternal grandmother's home to hide until the storm passed. But here is the detail that matters. He did not run to save himself. He stayed and took beatings meant for his younger brothers and sisters. He put his small body between his father's anger and his siblings. He was protecting them at an age when he should have had nothing to protect himself from. It is possible, the biographers say this carefully, that Emilio's rage toward Joaquin was specifically intensified by the fact that Joaquin kept standing up to him. That every time the father raised his hand to a younger child, the eldest son who was still home stepped into the way. A pattern of defiance that started in childhood and never really stopped. Then, when Joaquin was a teenager, Emilio kicked him out of the house entirely. Sit with that for a second. This man brought his son into the drug trade as a child. He took him out of school. He put him to work in the poppy fields. He beat him, and then he threw him out of the home. A teenager with no education, no money, and no prospects beyond the mountains of Sinaloa, cast out into the world with nothing but the criminal knowledge his father had already given him. Joaquin went to live with his grandfather, and that is where the transition from family drug operation to something much larger began. You cannot tell the story of how Emilio shaped El Chapo without talking about the other man in his family network, a man named Pedro Aviles Perez. Pedro Aviles Perez was Joaquin's uncle. And Pedro Aviles Perez was not a poppy farmer. He was not a subsistence cattle rancher hiding a side operation in the mountains. Pedro Aviles Perez is considered one of the founding figures of modern Mexican drug trafficking. He pioneered the use of aircraft to move drugs, one of the first people to take the trade from mountain roads and pack animals to airplanes and organized logistics. He built the early networks that the Sinaloa drug world would eventually inherit. He was the bridge between rural poppy farming and industrial-scale narcotics distribution. Emilio Guzman Bustillos was related to this man. The family connection ran through blood, and in the mountains of Sinaloa, family connection meant access. When Emilio needed to move the opium gum from their harvest into the supply chain, Pedro Aviles and his network were how it happened. The product went from their remote mountain operation to Culiacan, the capital of Sinaloa, through that connection. Without Pedro, the Guzmen family operation was a poppy farm. With Pedro, it was part of something bigger. When Emilio threw his teenage son out of the house, that family network was the only door Joaquin had left to walk through. He knew the product, he knew the terrain, he knew the harvest cycle, and he had the blood connection to a man who ran a serious drug operation. So that is exactly where he went, and this was the beginning of El Chapo's actual criminal career. Not some dramatic recruitment, not a meeting in a back room. He walked toward the only relative who could use the skills he had already been given because his father had made sure he had no other skills to offer the world. By his late teens and early 20s, Joaquin was working within the network Pedro Aviles had built. He learned distribution routes. He learned how to move product from the mountains to the cities. He learned the organizational structure of a drug operation at a level his father's small farming enterprise could never have taught him. And when Pedro Aviles died in a shootout with federal police in 1978, the next generation was already positioned to step into the gap. Now we have to talk about Maria Consuelo Loera Perez, and this is the part of the story that people almost never examine closely, because the image of Consuelo, El Chapo's mother, is almost universally sympathetic. She is the small, elderly woman in the photographs, the one who gave rare interviews and spoke quietly about her son, the one El Chapo built a house with a chapel for in La Tuna, the one who lived to be 94 years old and died in December 2023, and whom Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador caused a national controversy by personally visiting and shaking her hand. She is consistently presented as the victim of her circumstances, the quiet, faithful, suffering mother of a famous criminal. And there is truth in that framing. She did suffer. She lost 5 children to illness and malnutrition. She lived in extreme poverty. She endured what life in La Tuna handed her. But here is the reality that the sympathetic framing glosses over. Maria Consuelo Loera Perez knew exactly what was happening in her home. She knew Emilio was running a drug operation. She knew her children were working in the poppy fields. She knew Joaquin dropped out of school not because of some administrative failure, but because his father put him to work instead. She was there. She was in that house. She watched it happen. And not only did she not stop it, she became one of her son's most vocal defenders long after the world knew exactly what he had become. In a rare interview with Frontline on PBS, before El Chapo's 2014 arrest, Consuelo sat for cameras and spoke about her son with warmth and quiet pride. She remembered him counting his stacks of paper money as a young man, organizing them into neat piles. She described him as ambitious from the very beginning. She told reporters that he would always be her child, that regardless of the path he chose, her love was unconditional. What she never said was that she tried to stop him. What she never said was that she warned him, intervened, or pushed back against the environment her husband was building in their home. She publicly denied, repeatedly, that El Chapo was truly the leader of the Sinaloa organization, insisting the government had made him a scapegoat. This, while her son was serving a life sentence in an American federal prison for trafficking enough drugs to supply a significant portion of the United States market for decades. The other surviving children of Emilio and Consuelo are not innocent bystanders either. Among them, Aureliano Guzmen, known as El Guano, who became a significant figure in the Sinaloa operation. Arturo Guzman, known as El Pollo, who served as a key operator. Miguel Angel Guzman, known as El Mudo. The family Consuelo raised did not produce one drug trafficker by accident. It produced several. Consuelo told him through her silence and her loyalty that what was happening in their home was acceptable, that the drugs were acceptable, that the beatings were acceptable, that the path his father was laying out for him was simply the reality of life, and that you love your family through it regardless. She was his emotional anchor. She was also part of the system that produced him. Speaking of what that system produced, let us follow the timeline forward. After El Chapo left La Tuna as a teenager and made his way into the broader drug world through the network his uncle had built, his rise was not slow. He had something most aspiring traffickers in that era did not: a deep native understanding of terrain, product, and supply chain logistics built from years of working them as a child. He was not learning the business from the outside. He had grown up inside it. By his late teens, he was already involved in small-scale marijuana cultivation with his cousins. Among them, the Beltran Leyva brothers, who would later become significant cartel figures themselves. Another family connection. another set of relatives who had been moving in the same direction their whole lives. In his 20s, El Chapo left Badiraguato entirely. The mountains had given him everything they could. He moved toward Culiacan and then into the orbit of the most powerful drug organization in Mexico at the time, the Guadalajara operation run by Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo, known as El Padrino, the Godfather. Felix Gallardo had built a dominant structure that handled the movement of Colombian cocaine through Mexico into the United States. He needed people who understood logistics, who were fearless, and who knew the terrain. El Chapo was all of those things. His first role was humble, reportedly a driver for leadership, but it did not take long. He had an instinct for the operational side of trafficking that stood out even in a room full of experienced criminals. He began supervising logistics, he mapped routes, he oversaw the movement of product, and by the mid-1980s he was no longer a driver or a field hand. He was a manager within one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the Western Hemisphere, having gone from his father's poppy farm to the inner circle of the Guadalajara structure in roughly a decade. But El Chapo had no idea what was coming. When Felix Gallardo was arrested by Mexican authorities in 1989, the Guadalajara operation fractured. Territories were divided. Different corridors went to different factions. And El Chapo, now in his early 30s, with a full decade of operational experience, with the loyalty of his own network of men, with family bloodlines running through multiple criminal organizations, stepped out from under the Guadalajara structure and began building something of his own. What he built would become the Sinaloa organization, the structure that his sons would eventually inherit, the operation that would move more drugs into the United States than any other in history. Here's where everything connects, because the Sinaloa operation did not come from nowhere. It came from Badiraguato, it came from La Tuna, it came from the poppy fields that Emilio Guzmen put his son to work in before the boy could read properly. The logistics genius El Chapo became famous for, the tunnels under the border, the use of multiple transportation methods, the distribution cells that put product in dozens of American cities simultaneously. That genius was built on a foundation his father laid. Not a foundation of business education or criminal mentorship in any formal sense, a foundation of knowing, from childhood, how a drug supply chain works, how product moves from a remote growing location through an intermediate point to a distribution center, how you handle terrain that law enforcement cannot easily access, how you maintain relationships with the people who carry the product because they are family and because they have no other options. El Chapo scaled everything his father did. He industrialized it. He brought in partners, Ismael El Mayo Zambada, Hector Palma Salazar, the Beltran Leyva cousins from his youth. He built the infrastructure his uncle Pedro Aviles had started and took it to a level no one in Mexican history had reached before. By 2003, the DEA estimated the Sinaloa operation controlled 40 to 60% of Mexico's entire drug trade. By 2009, Forbes was listing El Chapo among the most powerful people in the world. And through all of it, through the escapes, the billions, the violence, his mother kept his portrait on her wall in La Tuna and kept telling anyone who would listen that the world misunderstood her son. El Chapo was first arrested in 1993, a dramatic operation that ended years of pursuit. He bribed his way to relatively comfortable conditions and ran the operation from inside. Then in 2001, he escaped in a laundry cart from a maximum security prison, one of the most audacious jailbreaks in Mexican history. He spent 13 years as a fugitive, running the most powerful drug organization in the world from safe houses in the mountains his father had shown him as a child. He was recaptured in 2014, escaped again through a tunnel in 2015, a mile-long passage that exited into a house near the prison, a construction project of staggering complexity, caught again in 2016. Extradited to the United States in 2017, and on July 17, 2019, a federal judge in Brooklyn sentenced Joaquin Archivaldo Guzmen Loera to life in prison plus 30 years. He was also ordered to forfeit $12.6 billion. Life plus 30 years for a man who had his first encounter with the drug trade before he was old enough for 4th grade. His sons followed the path he carved. Ivan Archivaldo, Jesus Alfredo, Ovidio, and Joaquin Jr., the Chapitos, took over the Sinaloa operation. Ovidio was arrested in 2023 and extradited to the United States. Joaquin Jr. was captured in 2024. The dynasty his father helped build and that he expanded to global scale is now being dismantled one family member at a time by American federal prosecutors. His brothers, the ones who survived childhood in the Guzmen household, did not escape the gravity of the family business either. Aureliano El Guano became a significant figure in the operation. Arturo El Pollo was killed. The family Emilio and Consuelo built produced not one generational criminal enterprise but a network that extended across blood and across time. And Consuelo? She lived to be 94. She spent her final years in the house in La Tuna that Joaquin built for her, the one with the chapel. She attended church. She gave occasional interviews. She never stopped defending her son publicly. She died in December 2023 while El Chapo sat in a federal supermax facility in Florence, Colorado, never to see the outside of a prison again. This case shows us something that is uncomfortable to say out loud but impossible to ignore. El Chapo did not choose this path from a list of options. He was put on it before he was old enough to understand what a path was. His father took him out of school, put him to work in a drug operation, introduced him through family bloodlines to one of the founding figures of Mexican narco trafficking, and then threw him out of the house as a teenager with no education and nowhere else to go. His mother watched, stayed silent, and then spent the rest of her very long life defending the outcome. The system that produced Joaquin Guzmen was built by the people who were supposed to protect him. That does not excuse what he became. The 34,000 deaths attributed to his organization are not a statistic. They are 34,000 families who also did not choose the path they ended up on. The fentanyl flooding American communities, the violence in Mexican cities, the corruption that hollowed out institutions for decades. All of it connects back to the organization he built, and the organization he built connects back to a poppy field in La Tuna, where a little boy worked because his father told him to. The cycle is not just about El Chapo, it is about what happens when poverty, geography, family, and criminal culture combine into something that feels to the people living inside it like the only possible reality. Like there is no other way, like survival looks exactly like this. El Chapo told Sean Penn that from age 15 on, in that area there were no job opportunities, that there was no other way to survive. And while that is the statement of a man justifying a lifetime of violence and destruction, it is also a window into the world Emilio Guzmen dropped his son into without a ladder out. The most powerful drug lord in history was built in a shack in the mountains of Sinaloa by a cattle rancher who was also a poppy farmer, by a mother who watched and stayed loyal, by an uncle who opened the door, by a system of poverty and geography that made everything else feel impossible. That is the Guzmen family. That is where El Chapo came from. Today, Joaquin El Chapo Guzmen is locked in the ADX Florence Supermax in Colorado, arguably the most secure prison facility in the United States. He has no contact with the outside world beyond what the law minimally requires. The empire he built is fracturing. His sons are in custody or on the run. His brothers are either dead or pursuing the same trajectory toward prosecution. His mother is gone. His father has been gone since the 1980s. The mountains of Badiraguato are still there. The poppy fields are still there. And there are still children growing up in communities exactly like La Tuna, being handed exactly the same set of options that Emilio Guzman handed his son 65 years ago. The Guzman family made El Chapo, and what this story really asks us is, how many more are being made right now in the same way, by the same forces, in places the rest of the world does not look at until it is too late? I want to know what you think. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Specifically, do you think El Chapo was a product of his environment? Or do you believe at some point every person chooses their own path, regardless of where they started? Because that debate is at the center of everything we covered today. If this video gave you something to think about, hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people. Subscribe if you want to keep going deeper on these stories, and I will see you in the next one.